Good. We are going to listen now our speakers. They will speak. We talk about the general topic, freedom of religion, from the USCIRF report on persecution in Russia to violation in Europe. I remind you that you have a maximum of 20 minutes to share your speech, or less, as you want. Our first speaker is Jason Morton, the policy analyst, author of the report. He could not participate in real time, but sent us a video. And I asked Giorgio, can you please show the video of Jason Morton?
Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today and for your interest in the important work of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is a bipartisan commission created by Congress to monitor international religious freedom conditions and make policy recommendations to the U.S. government. In August 2020, USCIRF published my report on the anti-cult movement and religious regulation in Russia and the former Soviet Union. And I appreciate the opportunity to introduce this research and discuss the ideas and concerns motivating it. The primary purpose of this report was to understand and describe the complex landscape of religious freedom and religious regulation in the former Soviet Union, including the ways in which developments in Russia influenced those in other former republics like Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, as well as vice versa. These dynamics are too often dismissed as something uniquely Russian or vaguely Soviet. Yet while the Soviet legacy of current legislation is in fact real and significant, I found that it was impossible to describe the rise and shape of religious regulation in the region without describing the immense impact of Western influences like the anti-cult movement. Indeed, rather than something uniquely Russian or Soviet, contemporary religious regulation in Russia and Central Asia is heavily indebted to influences emanating from the West, including the anti-cult movement, as well as the rhetoric and policies of the so-called war on terror in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. In Russia and former Soviet Central Asia, these ideas helped to justify a return to religious policies born in the Soviet era, which primarily perceived religion as a threat to be managed and restricted rather than as a basic human right. The anti-cult movement first emerged in North America and Western Europe during the 1970s and 80s, after traumatic events such as the Manson family murders in 1969 or the Jonestown massacre in 1978 raised fears about the perceived threat of secretive groups. The movement was also informed by fears about communist infiltration during the Cold War, borrowing pseudoscientific concepts like brainwashing and mind control, and the theories of psychologist Robert J. Lifton and anti-communist activist Edward Hunter. Anti-cult rhetoric depicts new religious movements as fanatic and bizarre, and portrays individual members as helpless victims without their own free will or ability to save themselves. This rhetoric enables groups to justify the forced removal of friends or relatives from the religions of their choice, and even advocates for deprogramming regimens that use coercive and highly questionable psychological techniques. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a fragile Russian state, eager for stability and unity, adopted many aspects of this anti-cult program, fueling a crackdown on religious minorities that has yet to diminish or end. In this context, the rhetoric of brainwashing, mind control, zombification, and totalitarian sects, which are frequently used to justify harsh measures, taps into fears about the Soviet past and its subjugation of the individual to a malevolent collective. There is a perverse logic at work here. Fears about the Soviet legacy have been leveraged to introduce Soviet-era laws and repressive tactics. Contrary to popular perception, the Soviet Union never outlawed religion. It regulated it. Most Bolsheviks were convinced that the old beliefs were rooted in human suffering and would simply fade away as the attainment of communism removed any underlying need for them. Yet as religion failed to disappear, Soviet animosity towards religion in general, and to the Russian Orthodox Church in particular, intensified. Anti-religious campaigns accelerated over the course of the 1920s, culminating in a 1929 law on religious associations that set the pattern for religious regulation for the rest of Soviet history and beyond. The law required all religious groups to register with the state in order to receive legal status, made all religious activity outside the confines of a recognized church illegal, and banned the religious instruction of minors or the distribution of religious literature. In 1943, at the height of World War II, Stalin rehabilitated the Russian Orthodox Church's standing in Soviet society in order to harness its popularity for the state. The Russian Orthodox Church became a quasi-state religion with privileged status. Other so-called traditional religions like Islam enjoyed similar status in regions where they dominated. Later laws reinforced the primacy of legal registration, carefully delineating the eligibility requirements and permitted activities of registered groups. Registered religious groups were generally deemed safe and even useful, while those who failed or refused to register with the state, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, were deemed enemies of the state and treated accordingly. When the Soviet Union collapsed, what had been a trickle of religious interest during the late Soviet era became a flood as beleaguered citizens sought stability and reassurance. Although the majority of society remained non-religious, most religious groups experienced a dramatic increase in membership, especially new religious movements like the Church of Scientology, the Unification Church, and the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. This period also witnessed the rapid rise of the anti-cult movement in Russia, which is perhaps best illustrated through the career of its most prominent proponent in Russia, Alexander Dworkin. Dworkin fled the Soviet Union and spent the period between 1977 and 1992 in the United States, where he embraced Russian Orthodox Christianity and spent time working at the US government-sponsored news outlet, Voice of America. In 1993, after returning to Russia, Dworkin founded the Saint Irenaeus of Lyon Information Consultation Center, or SILIC, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church and with the blessing of then Patriarch Alexei II. Almost 30 years later, SILIC remains the propaganda center of the anti-cult movement in Russia and maintains an online database of new religious movements, as well as an archive of writings by Dworkin primarily. Dworkin has long provided the anti-cult movement with a veneer of intellectual credibility. Since 1999, he has taught sectarian studies at the Russian Orthodox Church's University of St. Tikhon, yet his degree in medieval studies provides no academic grounding in religious studies or the sociological and psychological concepts on which he so frequently relies. At a seminar in 1993, he allegedly coined the term totalitarian sect, a concept which effectively merged Western anti-cult ideas with the post-Soviet context, where anxiety about the return to the Stalinist past competed with fears about an unstable present. On September 26, 1997, the Russian Federation passed a federal law which ended the state's permissive treatment of religious minorities that had existed in place since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and introduced regulations based on previous Soviet policy. An arduous registration process once again required all applicants to provide the names and personal information of founding members, all of whom had to be Russian citizens. They had to turn over founding documents and religious literature and prove that the organization had existed on Russian territory for at least 15 years. Unsurprisingly, many religious minorities struggled to register in this system, which could also delay or deny their claim through an array of bureaucratic mechanisms. The law was in fact designed to bolster established faiths and limit the spread of new religious movements. The preamble to the law acknowledges the special role of orthodoxy in the history of Russia and in the establishment and development of its spirituality and culture, as well as that of religions like Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, which constitute, quote, an integral part of the historical heritage of the peoples of Russia, end quote. The Russian Orthodox Church, the anti-cult movement, and Dworkin in particular, had intensely lobbied and mobilized supporters to push for this law's passage. Dworkin's ideas about the need to rescue helpless citizens from the clutches of totalitarian sects through repressive religious regulations found allies in a government that was eager to reassert its control over society and culture. The subsequent widespread abuse of such laws in Russia is ample proof of their flawed nature. USCIRF does not advocate the exemption of religious groups or individuals from legal prosecution under a reasonable and equitable process, but laws that specifically target religion, that seek to define correct belief and punish nonconformity, are inherently flawed and unjust, effectively enabling the kind of authoritarian abuses that they claim to want to prevent. In his 2000 Russian national security concept, Putin claimed that the protection of the cultural, spiritual, and moral legacy, historical traditions, and norms of social life was a matter of national security, and argued for the formation of government policy in the field of the spiritual and moral education of the population. Putin's administration has implemented this policy of spiritual security to steadily constrict the moral and spiritual sphere, including under the guise of anti-cult rhetoric and the war on terror. Russia has indeed faced a legitimate threat from Islamist terrorism, but the laws that it adopted go well beyond the scope of counterterrorism. In 2002, Russia adopted the Law on Combating Extremist Activity, which contains no clear definition of extremism and allows for the prosecution of things like incitement of social, racial, or ethnic or religious hatred, or, quote, the propagation of exclusiveness, superiority, or inferiority of an individual based on his or her social, racial, ethnic, religious, or linguistic identity, or his or her attitude toward religion. These broad definitions and explanations of what constitute extremism effectively allow the government to target any speech or activity that it takes issue with. A 2012 study by the Savas Center in Moscow found that religious organizations constituted the majority of those accused under the new extremism law. Just like the war on terror, the anti-cult movement is also international in scope and influence. In 2009, the same year in which he was appointed head of Russia's Council of Experts, tasked with monitoring religious activity and approving local registration, Alexander Dworkin also became vice president of the European Federation of Research and Information Centers on Sectarianism, or FECRIS, a French anti-cult organization with pan-European, indeed international influence. The French government provides the majority of FECRIS's funding, and the group regularly spreads negative propaganda about religious minorities, including at international forums like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Human Dimensions Conference, held every year in Poland. Over time, the rhetoric and ideas of the anti-cult movement in the Russian state have converged noticeably. In 2012, Putin claimed that totalitarian sects were, quote, growing like mushrooms and presented a distinct threat to society that had to be addressed by legal mechanisms at both the local and federal levels. In July 2016, the Russian government adopted a package of amendments commonly known as the Yarovia Law, which significantly enhanced the scope and penalties of previous religious and anti-extremism laws. The law characterized sharing religious faith or extending invitations to religious services as a legal missionary activity, if it occurs outside of officially registered spaces, including in private homes or over the internet. The law enables the government to monitor private electronic communications in what observers characterized as a direct echo of the sweeping powers yielded by the KGB in Soviet times. On April 20th, 2017, Jehovah's Witnesses were banned outright across Russia, based on the accusation that the church was an extremist organization. The same year, USCIRF recommended Russia for designation by the State Department as a country of particular concern, or CPC, under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, as one of the world's worst violators of religious freedom. All of these issues discussed today have an impact beyond the Russian Federation, not least in Ukrainian territories illegally occupied by Russia. Russia brought along its restrictive religious regulations when it invaded Crimea in 2014, including the symbiosis between anti-cult ideas and national security, or so-called spiritual security. The occupation regime in Ukraine frequently uses religious regulations to terrorize the general population, targeting Jehovah's Witnesses and members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as well as activists in the Crimean Tatar community, the majority of whom are Muslim and who are frequently charged with extremism and terrorism for their political opposition to the Russian occupation. In post-Soviet Central Asia, repressive religious policies mirror those in Russia, with mandatory registration and broad extremism legislation that targets religious minorities. Yet for the most part, these tend to draw more on the rhetoric of the war on terror than the anti-cult movement. In Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, for instance, registration is mandatory and all unregistered religious activity is illegal. Thousands of mosques have been destroyed or turned into movie theaters, factories, and sporting clubs, which local officials believe to be of more value and less threatening than religion. Kazakhstan is the one Central Asian country with a particularly robust anti-cult movement. It is also the only Central Asian state that retains a significant population of ethnic Russians and therefore an influential Russian Orthodox Church presence. This is a strong indication of the link between the anti-cult movement and the Russian Orthodox Church. Although not all Russian Orthodox Church clergy agree with the anti-cult movement or sanction its ideology, Russian Orthodox clergy and laity often play significant roles in the movement, and anti-cult centers are frequently funded by local parishes or hosted in church facilities. Before the enactment of its 2011 religion law, Kazakhstan had been one of the least repressive post-Soviet Central Asian states in regards to religious freedom. The religion law in 2011, however, set stringent registration requirements with high membership thresholds and banned restricted unregistered religious activity while subjecting religious groups to police and secret police surveillance. As a result of the law's registration requirements, the total number of registered religious groups fell sharply after 2011, especially the number of, quote, non-traditional religious groups, which declined from 48 to 16. Although the religion law considers all religions to be equal, its preamble specifically recognizes the historical role of Hanafi Islam and Orthodox Christianity, in an echo of the preamble to Russia's 1997 legislation. On Kazakhstani government web pages and state television, so-called experts demonize religious minorities and claim that they use, quote, programming or, quote, zombification techniques to prey on young people with psychological problems and turn them against their families and even against society at large. To combat this threat, the government funds anti-sect centers that distribute information about the dangers that these groups pose to the country. The government also supports rehabilitation centers that claim to successfully, quote, deprogram victims through a combination of psychological, theological, and pedagogical methodologies, many of them influenced by the anti-cult movement. The first such center in Kazakhstan was founded in 2007 with the support of Alexander Dworkin and the Russian anti-cult movement. The common denominator among all of these countries discussed today is the shared desire for stability after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which all of them experienced as a socioeconomic catastrophe. They are also heavily influenced by the rise of Islamist terrorism. The rhetoric of the Russian anti-cult movement or the war on terror effectively helps these governments to justify a return to repressive Soviet legal norms, even as they symbolically distance themselves from that problematic past. The anti-cult movement is fundamentally a propaganda outlet, conducting a highly effective information war against religious minorities throughout Russia and many of the countries in which Russia retains influence. An effective response to this movement must also engage at the level of information, countering the perverse logic of anti-cult propaganda with hard facts about its lack of credibility and its complicity in the suppression of religious freedom. Panels like this one are essential to that process, and it is a privilege to participate with you all today. Thank you.
I thank Jason Morton for his wonderful presentation, and I hope to meet him in person one day. To thank again him for his excellent work.